the 25th edition of the ET Awards for Corporate Excellence.
Last Saturday, all roads in Mumbai led to NCPA, where ET hosted the 25th ET Awards for Corporate Excellence.
A prestigious gathering where titans of industry, trailblazing entrepreneurs, eminent policymakers, influential bureaucrats, and icons from the world of culture and entertainment come together. As we mark 25 glorious years of the Economic Times Awards, we stand at the cusp of a new era, one where leadership and excellence will shape the destiny of a rising India.
The starry event saw participation from the top CEOs and policymakers discussing all that's buzzing in the world of business, geopolitics, and most importantly, the environment. One of the most significant conversations of the night was a fireside chat between Finance Minister Nirmala Sitharaman and ET's executive editor, Sruthijith KK.
We are very close to coming to a final call on some of the very critical issues, reduction, rationalizing the GST, looking at the number of slabs and so on. Globally now, because of the tariff uncertainties, because of the ineffectual way in which WTO operates, you are going to depend on bilateral agreements rather than look at multilateral. Every agency outside says India is the fastest growing country. All right, not 12%, at least 6.5, at least 7. And when I say at least, it's not to say I want some concessions in understanding. 6.5 or 7 sustained for the last post-COVID era. Are we serious?
From GST to tariffs, from a takedown of the WTO to warnings against increased dumping from China, there's a lot to be unpacked in this episode. So stay tuned because you don't want to miss this. It's Tuesday, March 11th. I'm your host, Diya Rekhi, and you are listening to The Morning Brief from the Economic Times.
What a spectacular audience and what an amazing setting to be marking the 25th edition of ET Awards. Thank you all for being with us here today. And most of all, thank you, ma'am, for joining us this evening. Your budget this year, ma'am, created a lot of positivity, as Cyrus also said, with the tax cuts, with the continued support for CapEx, and staying the course with the fiscal consolidation. But as we meet now, we are focused on a lot of geo-economic uncertainty. There is a raging tariff war, which no one is able to predict what course it's going to take. What is going to be India's game plan? How should we negotiate this, and how are we going to negotiate with the US?
Well, in a broad sense, I think both sides should have ambition for a good treaty. And nobody can fault that. Particularly for India, when you're looking at Viksit Bharat, you need to have a good traction. Everybody is concerned about the growth numbers. You want it to be not in single digit, you want the growth to be in double digit and all that. You still need to do a lot more to strengthen our exports. So I'm sure the Commerce Minister is quite seized of this, and he would take this agreement to meet the ambitions that we have in terms of promoting growth, in terms of ensuring that our supply chains are intact and smooth and flowing well. And therefore, that would guide his negotiations, I would think.
So geo-economic fragmentation is now a reality. In some ways, it's a reversal of the forces of globalization that have created a lot of prosperity in this century. Do you think this will impede India's growth momentum?
I see for every challenge that exists in these kind of fragmentation or tariff war or some economies reaching a deflationary level, lack of demand overseas, I see in each one of them an opportunity. And I would thank that kind of a tendency growing in us who are all in the cabinet. I'm sure Ashwini ji will vouch for what I'm saying. That kind of a tendency being built into us or being a love to grow within us is something which we draw from the PM. We says wherever there is a challenge, you forget there is an opportunity, not just one, maybe a couple of opportunities in them. So I would think whether it is geo-fragmentation or supply chain disruption or tariff wars or strategic disruption to free flow of trade or multilateralism now taking a different kind of a multipolar angularities. In each one of them there is an opportunity for us, and it is for us to very smartly move to make sure that this is the opportunity that India was waiting for, and we should use it so that, after all, it is another 22 years before we should reach the goal of a Vikasit Bharat. So I'm sure every Indian is expecting all of us to move in that kind of a speed.
Now, while other countries also face an offensive tariff action from the US, there is a very real chance that some of them could try and dump their goods in India. Is that an eventuality we are seriously watching against?
Well, yes, you're already seeing signs of that. Dumping of excess inventory which is sitting with any country, you know largely who we are talking about. When such chances exist, we will have to guard ourselves against it. So how carefully we can find a way to avoid the dumping, however much there is a layer of Indian manufacturers, small, medium-sized, who prefer cheaper inputs. But even then, the larger consideration should be to be able to give them the access to cheaper inputs, but not become a victim of dumping. These are the balancing kind of acts that we have to do, and that I'm sure many of you all will agree, but I would still say it here, we do it in consultation with the stakeholders. It's not as if we sit in Delhi, we plan for it, and then we do it irrespective of what the stakeholder wants. And in the stakeholder, they are not one block. Within them, there are sections which prefer complete stoppage of dumped goods, and some sections which prefer a calibrated approach on it. So government's task it is to make sure that we plan for it and balance everybody's interests.
You've spearheaded major reforms in taxation, now in personal tax, but previously also in corporate tax. Is it time now to look at a more comprehensive or rationalization of GST slabs? The IMF has also advocated it.
Well, I think we've started this exercise. In fact, at the time when we started it, I would say it was late 22 when we started this exercise of rationalizing the GST, for the rates, for the number of slabs, and on the other side for compliance and the process itself. So the twin-pronged approach to simplify GST was started late 22, early 23. Some people were saying you're not even allowing to settle for the GST to settle. After all, it was launched in 2017. You're already starting to revamp it. You're not allowing it to reach its normal course to see what is an average earning that you can get out of it per month. And so there was an element of discouragement, but we didn't stop it. There were different groups of ministers who were looking at it. And every time there is a state government election and there is a change of ministers, we revamp the committees. But that work is almost reached a finale. Now, at this stage, there is one more look that I've taken it upon myself. The groups have done excellent work, but I still have taken it upon myself to once more completely review each of the group's works and then probably take it to the council to see if we can come to a final conclusion on, yes, we agree on these, yes, we have changed these. So we are very close to coming to a final call on some of the very critical issues: reduction, rationalization of rates, looking at the number of slabs, and so on.
Is there any possibility you can give us a glimpse into what is in store? Any more than you have said?
I think I was very clear. Reduction in rate. And that is not as though we are now exploitatively high in rates. I've said this number number of times. At the time when the GST was launched, the revenue neutral rate was somewhere 15.8%. Meaning, in simpler terms, any item on which GST is levied if you would levy it at 15% rate, you would still not have increased the rate for the consumer, nor have you have lost the revenue which has to come from it. Since after the launch of GST until 23, we had already brought that 15.8 to 11.4, which means rates have come down. And 15.8, when it was launched, that average was itself lesser than what it was pre-GST. So let me dispel any doubting Thomases here that the GST has made life costlier after it was introduced. Item by item, I would challenge anyone to tell me if there is any one item for which the GST rate has gone up after the introduction of GST, and therefore, naturally, by inference, if 15.8 has become 11.4, it's only come down even further. So the clue that you want is it'll come down even further down.
Fabulous. I think we can all, yes, applaud to this particular rationalization. Ma'am, let's come to the topic of private investment, which we have discussed at the ET Award stage last year as well. Analysts say private investment is happening, but it is somewhat narrowly focused on a few sectors. What would be your expectations for a more broad-based resurgence in private investment?
This question being asked to the government is actually being asked to the wrong entity. If industry wants to invest, or industry is investing, or industry, as you say, is investing only in some sectors and not in others, or it has to broad base, these are all commercial decisions. It is for industry to speak about it. I'm not asking them to say why they are or why they are not, but I'd certainly like them to talk about things about investment. After all, if they don't speak out, how is the government to have any clue on how things are moving? And if we don't hear it from the horse's mouth, who else would we rely? Somewhat I will hesitate to rely on media on this. Sruthijith has not caught me.
I'll take half a moment to recover from that. Ma'am, I'll now come to the question that perhaps you might have expected me to ask in the beginning. The stock markets are seeing dizzying volatility. The sell-off by the FIIs, now we've seen some substantial sell-off by the FIIs, perhaps for the last 6 months or so. This has led to now a resurgence in the clamor for a reduction in the capital gains taxes applicable to them. Do you see any merit in this argument?
As I said, there are some taxation matters on which, particularly the parliament session being on course, budget session that is, there's only an intermission. The session is not sine die shut, and we are resuming on Monday, the most inappropriate time for a finance minister to talk on tax.
All my desperate attempts at headline hunting are going nowhere, as you can see. I won't even try to drag you anymore into this markets question. It's quite clear that you don't wish to deliberate on it. Ma'am, on the matter of public sector banks, many of them do now need capital to support, the growing demand for credit. Is the government open to reducing its stake in PSBs below 51%? Will we see some moves now?
Not specific to today's context. That we'll have to reduce and allow retail shareholders participate in public sector banks is a principle agreed to by this government. We will be increasing the public vote. We want to have more and more common public, retail investors in banks to be actively buying and selling shares and get into the secondary market, and be also, if anything, representing themselves to the boards.
Ma'am, there has been some concerns expressed that, while chasing returns, shadow banks or NBFCs, their lending towards microcredit hasn't gone too well. What is your view on this, or are these concerns that you share?
There were some concerns at least a year ago, but I think the RBI came in time, gave quite a good guidance. Sometimes people thought that was very tight. I think now again RBI is given some relaxation, and therefore the understanding of the RBI, of the government, and largely of the public is when NBFCs went too far too soon, too probably easily, it did cause concern. Not about every NBFC, but some, those who are small, who are very adventurous, and therefore the RBI had come in. Now I think there is good correction happening on that, so I'm sure it will settle down.
India is negotiating FTAs with a number of countries, including the EU bloc. What ought to be our guiding principles? What are the compromises we can make, and what are the ones that we can't?
Well, the first principle in that is put India's interest first. And in this, I won't shy away from saying some of the bilateral agreements done earlier, even with groups of countries, not just one-on-one bilateral, but India with a group, either the negotiations were very speedily handled, or the language of the document was very loose, or they were hasty understanding of the collateral which we'll face, that today the Commerce Ministry is engaged in review of many of the FTAs already signed, whether it is with Japan, whether it is with Korea, whether it's with ASEAN. There cannot be a second thought in India. No stakeholder will have a different opinion that in some of these agreements, India is facing a challenge. There are goods where you think you're very well concerned about, but because of the FTA, there is just a flood of goods coming in which you're not able to regulate. Duties don't make a difference to them because the FTA allows it. And therefore, the experiences and lessons learned from that kind of agreement signing, today our understanding is a good negotiation. And unless you do negotiate for India's own good, even your negotiation will not be taken seriously by the opposite side because they are very clear on what they want. But can you not be as clear? And therefore, I would think the approach now is to be a lot more hands-on on your negotiation. Take the stakeholders absolutely at every process with their inputs, not just consult them once and leave them, but as you progress, get guided by their inputs. And above all, on the larger principle, it is going to be a lot of bilaterals. It is not just India. Globally now, because of the tariff uncertainties, because of the ineffectual way in which WTO operates, you are going to depend on bilateral agreements rather than look at multilateral or even look at bilateral, but when things go wrong, you still have a WTO to fall back on? No, you probably don't have an effective WTO. I'm not saying it's not there. It is there. But with your complaints going there, you're not going to get any redressal in a near future. So what is the good of it? And therefore, bilateral, your interests first, and ensure the language of the agreement is such that you don't get into legal tussles too often.
There are a number of multilateral initiatives, such as on climate and BEPS, that India has been a very, very robust contributor to, from where the US has now withdrawn, and therefore, will India continue to engage despite who else leaves in these multilateral
The two-pillar solution, BEPS.
Yes.
I'm not sure if there is any alternative to what existed before for the BEPS negotiations or for the two-pillar solution. With US not participating, and it was US together with OECD and G7, which were taking it up very seriously to talk about the two-pillar solutions. And that was essentially the way in which one concern under the BEPS, base erosion, profit shifting, could be addressed. But if two pillars fallen, other concerns of BEPS remain, and there is no one particular group whose priority will be BEPS now when they are looking at what's going to happen to, let us say, the Western Europe's security considerations, or the Indo-Pacific, or the IPEF, or the Quad, or the NATO. There are very many such issues on which the world will be now discussing on priority. There will be a time when they'll come back to it. But at the moment, it's not BEPS and 2 pillar.
And we are projected to grow at about between 6.5 and 6.7% next year. I think everyone likes a faster, GDP growth. What would you say are maybe the 2 or 3 things that need to fall in place for us to achieve maybe 1 or 2 percentage points more in the growth rate?
See, this is an audience which knows about what are the things which are going to contribute to our growth. So there's no point in me first going in detail about it. But there's one thing on which definitely I'd like to take this opportunity, tell the media, make all of us think about is, like the markets, there is a sentiment which prevails in a country to grow. You need to have that positivity, you need to have that self-belief. And if this is said, the unsaid is, you need to be the last person to run down your own country. You need to believe in India's capacities. It is that sentiment which is missing, if anything, today, so that all of us can trust each other and say, yes, we can do it and move forward. Now, for every one good big thing which happens, there are 100 people who say, oh, it's nothing at all. Oh, come on, we did it during so-and-so's era as Prime Minister. So what you're doing now is no good. No, please. Earlier Prime Ministers would have achieved 100 things. In today's context, if you're achieving something, would you want to go along with it? Or stand against the tide and say, I believe what happened earlier, but I don't believe anything that you do today. Are you living in today or are you living in 60s and 70s India? We saw what happened in those ages. I'm not denying any achievements of any prime ministers of the day. But today, with the given challenges and with the kind of sustained growth that we are showing, and not just Indians saying it, you may question MOSPI's data, you may question anything. But every agency outside says India is the fastest growing country. All right, not 12%, at least 6.5, at least 7. And when I say at least, it's not to say I want some concessions in understanding. 6.5 or 7 sustained for the last post-COVID era. Are we serious? And there is not one sector which is also, not growing or which is lagging behind. For every one global disturbance, which we meet and try to rise above, the disturbance is forgotten. But the rigor with which you're going forward is the question. Oh no, but post-COVID, K-shaped recovery, B-shaped recovery, C-shaped. Ring all the alphabets you want, but we're moving forward, aren't we? So my expectation, other than everything else, banks will have to be robust, credit will have to be available, fuel cost will have to be low, more funds will have to be available for small and medium industries. The rigor with which you want to have ease of doing business should also trickle down to states. Your municipalities and local bodies will have to do well. All that said, sentiment, please. I would strongly pitch for an optimistic tenor, and not when we are not really growing at all. Fastest growing last 3-4 years continuously. At this time too, we don't want to be optimistic.
The message is loud and clear, and with that we come to the end of this session. A big round of applause to our always wise, always candid Finance Minister, Nirmala Sitharaman ji. Thank you so much, ma'am, for being with us.
This was an interesting conversation on so many different levels. But if I were to point out my biggest takeaways, it would definitely be that multilateral fora like WTO may get replaced by bilateral agreements. The finance minister saying that complaints going to WTO will not have redressal in the near future and hence serve very little purpose is a strong statement on the declining relevance of large organizations like the WTO or even the WHO. It also highlights how aligned India is with the US's view on the same. Are we looking at a bilateral trade agreement between the two countries soon? Let's see. Sitharaman's comments on GST coming down further is always music to everyone's ears. It remains to be seen, though, whether this unlocks private capex cycles at last. And of course, not to miss the Finance Minister's impassioned message to India Inc. to keep their faith in the India story. This conversation, if anything, was a sign of interesting times to come, and we'll continue to chronicle all of that on our podcast. So keep listening. It's Tuesday, March 11th. I'm your host, Diya Rekhi, and you were listening to The Morning Brief from The Economic Times. This episode was produced by Surohini Jain and sound designed by Indranil Bhattacharjee. Do share and subscribe if you enjoyed the episode. The Morning Brief drops every Tuesday, Thursday, and Friday on a listening platform of your choice. Thank you and have a great week.